Today we're going to dive deep into stories of extraordinary leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of business and beyond. As you already know, my name is Jay, and today I have a dynamic duo who, with us, will bring the wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. First off, we have Cambardella. Adele is a renowned business strategist and leadership expert with over 2 decades of experience in transforming organizations, and she's known for her innovative approach to leadership development and our ability to drive growth through strategic planning. Adele has worked with some of the world's leading companies, helping them to navigate complex challenges and achieve remarkable success. Our insight into the intersections of leadership, strategy, and organizational culture are truly invaluable. So joining Adele today is Chip Massey, a former FBI special agent turned business consultant and speaker. Chip has an incredible background in crisis negotiation, leadership under pressure. He has spent years handling high-stakes situations with precision and calm. So today he applies those same skills to the business world and helping leaders and teams to enhance their communication. Not only that, he helps them with building trust and achieving outstanding results. If you look at Chip's unique perspective on leadership and decision making, is both compelling and transform. Together, Adele and Chip have co-founded the innovative consulting firm Cambardella Massey Consulting, where they combine their expertise to help organizations and leaders reach new heights. Their collaboration is a testament to the power of diverse experience and the impact of strategic leadership. So in today's episode, we'll explore the journey, the lesson they've learned along the way, and the role fear plays in high-stakes situations. Without further ado, let's welcome Adele and Chip to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank
That's
you.
a big profile. All right. Yeah. So as we get started, because this is the first episode of our next season, which is a powerful episode. So can you both share a bit about your background and how your experience have shaped your understanding of fear in high-stakes situations?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So, Jay, for me, that's a really easy one. The FBI is set up primarily as responding to crisis or to do high-level investigations, and within that, in both cases, is fear. So I have seen people at their absolute worst in dealing with either some very tragic situations in the middle of serious investigations and prosecutions, and working in teams to deal with fear as well. So it's in a component of everything that I've experienced in my work life.
Yeah.
Adele?
Hi. I started out as an investigative journalist. In college, I worked for George Magazine, so John F. Kennedy Jr.'s publication, which was the intersection of politics and culture. 90s, which was a pretty high profile opportunity. And then after that, I worked for USA Today, and I had to pay back my student loans. So I went over to Madison Avenue and went over to the dark side, as they call public relations when you're a journalist first, and launched some of the biggest brands that you still use today: eBay, 1-800-Flowers, one that's gone by the wayside, which is moviephone.com, but many .coms on Madison Avenue, in a very big prestigious agency, Ogilvy, and moved from New York to Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., I started my own agency, and I had my own agency for about 15 years, specializing in crisis communications and public relations. And then I met Chip, and we work on a lot of crisis communications and immersive training programs with some pretty big companies like Deutsche Bank, SAP, Facebook, some really huge Meta, right? Some really huge brands, because we both brought our disciplines together, a pretty unique combination of skills.
All right. That's a great background and a great profile. Thank you for sharing that information with the viewers and the listeners. So now let's move to the other side of defining fear. because fear is actually a big word. All right. So how do you define fear in the context of high stakes situations, whether in the business world or in crisis negotiation? So I would love to hear from you both.
So, from an aspect that I'm used to, and I deal primarily with dealing with people and their emotional state. I did it in the bureau, and I'm also working to do that again with Adele. And one of the things that we know about fear, Jay, is how it takes over the brain's function. So we know that in high stress situations, when the brain feels that it's under attack, it feels like it's in trouble. It's, let's say it's normally functioning around a 1 in terms of its fear, but because of whatever the external stimuli is, it's now raised up to a 10. And what we know is that the analytical brain at that point moves offline. And what you're left with is the primitive brain. And the primitive brain is designed solely for three things. That's either going to fight, it's going to run away, or it's going to freeze. And so it's poorly designed to deal with a business situation. It's great in emergency situations when you have to confront a physical threat, let's say. But the body, brain, does not differentiate between what is a physical threat and what is a social threat. So it's the same thing, whether your boss is yelling at you or whether you've got somebody who's about to punch you. The brain interprets it in terms of an emotion and a crisis state in the same way. And what we know is that when the brain feels that way, it will release those chemicals, the cortisol and adrenaline, into the body. So you've got that coursing through your bloodstream, which has a huge impact on how you're going to function. So we know there that your analytical abilities are gone pretty much. We know that your vision, your peripheral vision, starts to diminish. We know that your fine motor skills also degrade. So texting is going to be difficult. Your respiration goes up, heart rate goes up. All things, again, that work against us in a context where we have to think on our feet, where we have to adapt to the situation, where we have to pull together a team and maybe call some directive action. And this is the typical world that Adele introduced me to in crisis communications. That is people who are functioning under that state. And then the next task is to de-escalate that. We can talk about that further on.
All right, Adele.
Do I define fear, or how have I seen fear? Is that the question? How have I seen fear play out
Yes,
in situations?
high stakes situations. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, my background is much different than Chip's. Obviously, he deals in life and death, and I deal in reputations, right? So, while we have a different of looking at it, like Chip said, people who are experiencing reputational harm feel the same way, like they are being attacked. Feel incredible. It is incredibly unfair. I've seen people from billionaires. I've worked with Ted Leonsis. I've worked with CEOs of multinational companies like Marilyn Houston. I've worked with the president of the United States. And these people in high stress situations, they are calmer than most people, but you can tell that they are processing the stress in different ways than other people do. And they understand that as the stress is coming at them, they have strategies to sort of deal with that and those feelings. And we talk a little bit about this in some of our trainings, which is this idea of de-escalation. And what is really incredible about some of these like super high performing players, really big A-listers, right? People who are the top of their game, is they are able to emotionally regulate that stress. They have strategies to regulate that stress, some of which we teach the executives we work with, especially in crisis situations. This is where Chip's overlay a crisis communications experience is just an incredible benefit to anybody who works with us, create business crisis, because no, it's just one of those things. Like, I know the first 5 things that they need to do. As soon as they call us up, they say we're having this crisis, this just occurred, and I know the first 5 things to do. I know it almost immediately, right? Within like maybe 10 minutes of talking to them. And whether or not they are ready to receive that advice, whether they are ready to act on that advice, is a totally different equation that I rely on and pass really to Chip to address people's emotions, that they are able to do what they need to do when the stakes are high. So it's an interesting combination.
Thank you for your own view about the subject matter. Honestly, I'm learning a lot of information today, especially when it comes to fear. Now, Chip mentioned one thing. We talked about fear takes over the brain. When you are in a situation where you're scared, automatically it takes over the brain and you cannot even function properly. Let your mind, start controlling you. So, but I want to move forward a little bit and talk about the impact of fear. You know, I want to, I want us to take a look at that. So, what are some common ways fear manifests in leaders? You talked about working with the President of the United States. So what are some common ways fear manifests in leaders during high stakes scenarios, and how can it impact decision making and team dynamics?
Yeah. So one of the things we see when a crisis occurs, and I'll let Chip talk about this a little bit, but I coined it, and it's this idea of the fairness fallacy. And essentially, like, a crisis happens to an organization, a person, it's really negative, really bad. And they call us up and they spend a tremendous amount of time focusing on how incredibly unfair the perception that other people have about them is. And it can last a really long time. And so you really have to move them off of that. But that's one way. Chip, do you want to
Mhm.
build on that? Or
Right. And I think also is that when people are in a crisis, like Adele just laid out there, is that they're typically at their worst, right? We're dealing with people that, whether we're calling it fear or high stress or critical situations, it's the same kind of dynamic. And like Adele said, some people deal with it rather well. Those are the exceptions. And so you kind of move down the spectrum and you can encounter all kinds of personalities that are dealing with it in their own unique way, and most of the time it's not helpful. It's kind of like, well, we've done everything right for the past 20 years, and this one thing, it's tripping us up and I don't understand it, it's not right. And like Adele said, it's the fairness fallacy. And what will happen is that they'll get stuck in that kind of mode of thinking, and Adele needs them to make some decisions, to do some actions that will absolutely help them out of the hole they're in currently. But the only way to do that is to get that analytical brain back online. So the longer they stay in that thinking, the worse off they're going to be.
The longer they stay in that thinking, the worse off they're gonna be. So now let me ask another question for both of you, which is more personal. So can ever experience a situation where you had to manage fear in a high pressure situation? How did you handle it? Because a lot of people want to learn from you personally right now. Yeah.
I think that should I throw that to you first?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the idea is that, again, as a hostage negotiator, I was dealing with people in fearful contexts that they're facing one of the worst days of their lives if I'm present in front of them or on a phone. And over 90% of what I did as a hostage negotiator took place over a phone. So I'm dealing with somebody that is in crisis mode. And so for me, in order to manage my stress in that situation, Jay, I had to manage it. And the way I was taught is that I would dial into that other person. And here's what we mean by that. We also call this in our book, Convince Me, reverse the focus. And the idea here is that you are so focused in on that other person. No longer, the focus is no longer on you. You have to make a transition mentally, that now everything that you are about, everything that you're seeing, everything that you're saying, everything that you're listening to is about that other person. And when you dial into someone else, Jay, at that level, here's what will happen is that everything else starts to fall away. So in a crisis that the hostage situation, there's a number of things going on. You've got police in the background, you've got walkie-talkie squawking, you've got sirens, you've got helicopters, you've got a lot of people shouting back and forth. There's a lot of movement of vehicles. It's a lot. And so in order for me to keep myself focused in, that's what I would do. I would think about that other person. I'd try to put myself in their shoes as much as I could. And that's the dial in method, to listen to that degree. Here's what happens to the brain. When you do that for yourself, here's the amazing thing is that your stress level starts to subside. You're going to start to feel that your stress, your whatever you're feeling in the moment that's a critical stage is going to decrease, because it's the very act of focusing in on somebody else and helping them will actually in turn help you deal with your stress, deal with your nerves. And it's a powerful tool if people can get this right.
Thank you. So Adele, do you have one or two
Yeah,
things you want to put in?
I have an example. I have an example, a professional example. So during Hurricane Maria, which hit Puerto Rico in 2017, I was one of the people who was flown in, like right after the aid workers were flown in to talk about how a lot of the hospitality and properties that were impacted by the hurricane, how they would message the conditions of their property, how they would talk to people about what happened, how they would address the damage that was done. And so it required me to go into a situation. And at this point, social media was everything, and it is now, right? And so, but they were completely offline. They had no ability to use social media. So we suggested a number of different, like, old school traditional marketing approaches, including like banners and billboards, and like we worked with people to kind of like bring their marketing back 20 years and address the crisis situation that was there. And the people were so impacted because they were both in work mode and in a personal mode, because their homes were destroyed and or properties were damaged, and they were trying to deal with the with what was going on with their own jobs and how to message that to other people. So there was just such an interesting and outpouring of passion, empathy, the people who were impacted, and just their sense of like wanting to do what was right for Puerto Rico, wanting to message this out such a way. There was such a sense of pride, and it was just really amazing to watch all of these leaders really just rise to the occasion, even though they were personally impacted. So I think a lot of times, leaders will just really surprise you. Some people will just be amazingly resilient, the worst of situations, and it can be really incredible. And that's the part of the work I think is very rewarding for us. Like, we're working through with people at their worst moments in their professional careers, and for Chip, sometimes in personal lives. As they go through these things, we really form a bond with these folks and sense of togetherness. And some people deal with it well. Most people don't, right? The first couple of weeks is kind of a nightmare for most executives we work with. And we're working it through. We're like, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We can tell you what's going to happen. Hey, you know what? Probably in the next 3 days, something bad might happen. We predict that's going to happen, and we'll give them some kind of a timeline, right? But when someone's telling you that something bad's going to happen to you, it's just like, that's going to cause you stress no matter what, right? Some executives are either able to be so incredibly calm. There's different personalities that prop up, and actually, Jay, we have a download in a sheet that if people want, we can send them that after, which has a list of the crisis personalities. We talk about that on our Crisis Communication Academy, which is an online course we offer. So happy to provide that to your listeners to get a sense of like what they can see, because you've got the person who freezes, you got the person who panics, you got the super calm person, and it just really ranges. I mean, you've probably seen that, Jay, in your experience, I would imagine, right? Like, so many personalities come about.
I know you deal with a lot of leaders, you spoke about working with some. So how do you see fear affecting business leaders? I'm talking about business leaders right now, because in this show is all about business, right? And leadership too. So how do you see fear affecting their ability to lead effectively? Or are there any patterns or specific triggers you've identified that you know that, okay, this is fear is affecting this leader or business leader to lead effectively?
So I would say the different triggers, right? It's a lot of times we are brought in because the leader has gone down a path that is not serving them, and they can't see why it's not serving them. And the idea of putting up a mirror to a leader and saying, see this very clearly, here's where it's going wrong. Here's what you might want to do instead is a very tough conversation because these people are very smart. They're very learned and they're usually like just too close to the situation, a more holistic approach. And therefore they're stuck. And so that conversation, one of those triggers where it's like, ooh, it's either going to be coachable or not. They're either going to be, a lot of times, initially, they will completely reject out of hand your suggestion. Right, Chip? I mean, like
Yeah.
we see they will completely reject it. They will not want it at all. They will throw it away. They will want to throw you away. They're like, I don't like that idea. And it's like, okay, you've kind of got to bring people to this point of view. Use a lot of the techniques that we have in our book that convince me. Just this thing called the convincing continuum, right? And the convincing continuum is this idea of you have to start at a point of agreement. So let's say you have a leader who's in a very fearful situation. They're nervous. Something bad has happened to them or something difficult. Maybe it doesn't even have to be a crisis, just maybe something difficult that's difficult for them to handle. You have to start at the point of agreement. You cannot start with your strongest point first. I can't say, Jay, you're 100% wrong for these 5 reasons. The leader will naturally go, you're wrong. I'm right. I'm not going to listen to a word you're saying. So you got to start at your point of agreement. It might be something like, hey, we both can agree that we want this situation to be over as quickly as possible. And then I might present something like fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which is called FUD, to unfreeze their cognitive biases, how they're feeling about that situation in the moment. And I might say things like, I understand that, this might be scary because your business is on the line. And I know things are uncertain right now. And I know that it's making you doubt what we're suggesting that you do. But what I want to implore you to do are these things. And here's how this has worked out for other folks. And you take them down a continuum and you get them to convince themselves that what you're suggesting is best for them. This is true of everyone, really, but especially of leaders in crisis situations. They have to come to the conclusion themselves. It cannot be something you force them into.
All right, Chip, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just say that if we remember the dynamic of the primitive brain and fear, what we often see are people acting out of that kind of construct. So if we think about people who are experiencing a crisis situation or some type of critical mass that has befallen them, what happens to us as humans dealing with our brain is that we tend to close off from outside sources, from people who could actually help us. That is, again, the fearful brain taking over. If you think about it from a cave perspective, from that primitive brain, it's going to withdraw. It's going to pull itself away where it thinks it's safe. Executives do the same thing. You'll see the door close more often. You'll see that they're not going to take too many calls. They're going to ignore the advice from experts like us and from their inner circle. And that's one. The second is that you're going to see them functioning with things that have worked for them in the past in maybe high stress situations, but are not suited for what they're facing right now. Because we rise to the occasion, but we're going to fall back on our training. Or in this case, they're going to fall back on what they've done in the past. And a lot of that behavior, Adele can attest to, is not healthy and it will ruin their reputation and what they need to be doing. It's the exact opposite, right? If you're the leader that is learning, has that learning mind, Jay, then what are you going to do? You're going to push beyond your fear as what will instruct them, and they're going to be receptive to other ideas. They're going to want that because they know that's the healthy response, and that will get them out of where they are right now.
But you got to get them to that point, right? You
Oh
can't
yeah.
even have that convincing continuum conversation until they're at that point where they can hear it. you
Yeah.
know.
All right. Thank you so much for that point of view. So now I have a question straight up to Chip. Drawing from your experience as an FBI negotiator. So what communication techniques do you find most effective in managing fear and maintaining control in high stakes situations?
Right. So the basics is going to be involving active listening. And I'm sure most of your listeners are very familiar with this. But the idea here, there's 8 concepts in active listening. And it ranges from being able to tell a person what they've just said to you, to labeling emotions, to using the I statements like I feel when you because. So, what you're doing is that you're implementing a whole series of steps, of theories, and constructs that are going to help that person think through about how they're dealing with the stress. So the first thing you want to establish in all these situations, and that's the number one priority we have going in, is to build trust with that executive. And it's so important that they are able to put their trust in us. They're not going to do it immediately unless they've heard of Adele. Many of them have, but it will take time to establish that. So we're going to be building rapport. We're going to be talking them through about the kind of feelings they're going through right now and the kind of decisions that they should be facing. And all that is in a collaborative aspect, Jay. Here's what I mean by that. We're not just there to point and do this, do that kind of thing. We're there to work with them. It's when people feel, if they're in a crisis or fearful state, high stress, when they feel they're all alone, that's the worst position to be in as a leader. So, what we come in with is we're here with you. We work this problem with you. It's the collaborative mind. And what happens to the brain when it feels that it has that kind of security, great things begin to happen. Their trust is going to build in us. They're going to unlock that creative mind that they have, and the primitive brain will come offline, and the analytical brain will start to come online. All these things are the positive aspects of growth in a relationship that indicates, okay, I hear what you guys are saying. I realize that we're kind of like stuck in a circle here. What do you suggest? How do we work through this? And that's exactly where we want them to be. But it takes a minute. You just can't expect somebody once you walk into a room, okay, it's you guys. We're going to trust you 100%. Never works that way. It always takes a little bit of time to get there.
All right, thank you so much. Adele, do you have anything you want to add to it?
Yeah, I think what Chip said is absolutely correct. I mean, he's really masterful at managing people's emotions in these kinds of situations, and they just have to be ready. And it's sometimes really hard to tell. Some people will walk in and they'll be at a 10, but they'll seem calm. So being able to like read those emotions, the little like, we call forensic listening, which is like this, just the art and science of analyzing a conversation after it's happened, because we believe words leave clues. And the way you do forensic listening, and this is really something that was evolved from Chip's expertise, so I'll let him talk about it. Forensic listening is just an incredible technique that anyone can use in any business meeting. It doesn't have to be a crisis. Chip, do you want to kind of explain the dynamics behind
Sure.
it?
And so forensic listening, you're going to listen to somebody from 4 categories, 4 areas of observation. And the first one, like say, is going to be what their emotional state is. And that can vary. So the person's in front of you that you're dealing with in a crisis mode, what is it that beyond that they're dealing with? What are their fears? What are their uncertainties? Where do you feel that they are really down or where they're really encouraged? You're going to make note of that. The other is going to be about the themes. What themes are they repeating? Because if somebody repeats something more than once, it's important to them. So it better be important to you if you want to get an idea about what they're about. Another is about their body position. And we differentiate body position from body language because we're all creatures of movement. So it depends on how we're facing a situation or a person. you're going to know through my actions. You're going to know how I am standing to you, or how I'm moving my hands, or whether my shoulders are slumped and I'm kind of bladed away from you. All these are indicators about how that person is feeling about a particular aspect of that conversation. So you're going to want to take note of that. And the last is voice, and that's their pitch, tone, and cadence of their voice. So when we're excited, we tend to go higher. And when we're not that enthused about something, we're just going to lose energy, right? And get deflated and go lower. But the idea here, Jay, is that you want to take note of all these things as you're observing somebody, whether it's in a regular meeting or in a crisis, and you're going to get a fuller picture, a more robust picture about who that person is and what's going on within them.
And then you can use it as a method for when you talk to them next, right? So you can say, hey, that thing that you said in the last meeting. And most times people are so excited that you listened enough that you know what their themes were in the last meeting. Or let's say you
Mm-hmm.
had a meeting 2 weeks ago and you said, you know what, Jay, wow, what you said in that meeting really made an impact on me. And these things, and I understood that you were super excited about this aspect of it. And I noticed that you got so much energy around this. Am I right about that? And you're asking people, you're taking an interest, you're validating what they've been interested in. And that level of paying attention to someone is so critical. And if you want to be influential, if you want to convince them of things, if you want to move them to a place where they might trust you, you listen to someone and they feel seen and heard. I mean, you're going to be a person that gets invited to the table more, who gets the gigs because they understand, they know that you understand them better than other people do. Just listening on a forensic listening level, like we just outlined, will put you in the top 1% of performers in corporate America. Most
Absolutely.
people do not listen at that level. They don't.
Thank you so much for that information. Listening is very important. I'm sure the listeners who are leaders, they've learned so much information from what you just shared today. So I'm sure they're gonna watch this video over and over again because the information is very, very key. So I have another question for Adele. So let's talk about strategies right now. That is transformative strategy because we always talk about turn lemon into lemonade. All right. So what strategies do you recommend for leaders to transform fear into a driving force for positive action and innovation? So turning their lemon to lemonade.
I would say to practice what we call targeted validation. And this is something that's going to sound so simple. It's going to sound like a compliment. It's going to sound like something that you just think of and you go, oh, that's not really that big of a deal. But it is transformative for teams. Most people on a team, and this is what Chip and I, we found with the research that we did with the leaders that we talked to when we wrote the book, is that most people want to be validated more than they want money, more than they want fame. They want validation. And most of us don't get it. And so if you are a leader who wants to transform your team, instead of being critical, validate what people are truly good at. It has to be authentic. It cannot be just fluff, right? It has to be like you're listening to them with that forensic listening quadrant we just talked about. And you're going back to them and you're saying, you have an enormous amount of untapped potential that's yet to be realized. And, you just stop there and allow someone to fill in what their potential is. Your ability to lead that person becomes so much easier because then they believe you're invested in them. And that's really how leaders succeed, is when someone believes you're invested in my future and what I think is important and what my potential. I mean, I will say, I've been around for a little while. I've never had a boss do that to me. Never in all of my career, not once. So that is a huge opportunity for leaders. And most people are scared. They don't want to validate. They worry about whether or not the person will go, oh, well, if I'm so good at this, maybe I'll go get another job. But it's the opposite. People will stay with you if you validate them. If you practice targeted validation in the way we talked about, incredible results. Incredible.
All right. Chip, do you have anything to add or, we're good?
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. So now let's move a little bit further to your consulting work together. So how do you approach the topic of fear in your consulting work together, do you have any collaborative techniques or framework that you find particularly effective when you're dealing with clients?
When it comes to fear, Chip, I mean, that's
I think it's about like what we said, Jay. It is really in the assessment. It's in kind of like the triage of examining what you're facing on the ground. Whenever we approach a new engagement, we're going to get in as much information as we possibly can. So before we've entered a room, we've done a lot of fact gathering. And whether that's on social media, whether it's in news reports, information about the company, if it's publicly traded, about the personnel involved, we're going to know a lot. And before we enter in a room with that person, we're going to have a pretty good idea about who they are, right? From a standpoint of what's available. Now, the next thing is going to be when we're talking to them. And we have a whole series of ways of interviewing somebody that is, again, designed to go deeper. Because that's really where we're going to meet that person and especially meet their needs in that moment, is if we understand their motivations, what we call their pattern of life, Jay. So again, we look at every engagement as if we're conducting a full-scale investigation, like I did in the FBI. And we're going to gather as much information about that person, that company, that team, whatever it is we're looking at, so that we understand them. We understand them well. We understand their motivations. We know what they're like perhaps when they first arrive at work. We know how they react when they're confronted with somebody who has a differing opinion. That's really what you want to do as a business leader as well. And we'll say this to your listeners, is that this is a very helpful tool. If people look at their interactions as if they were trying to build a profile of that individual, it's remarkably effective. If I know that when my boss comes in the morning, usually they're in a bad mood because they didn't like their commute, something, there's a problem that somebody's been calling them about the whole time they were in the car or on the train, wherever that is. And when they get to work, they're foul. They don't want to talk to anybody. They're going to close the door. We know that's not the best time to approach that person, right? We're going to wait a while. Similarly, if you are somebody who would like to talk to your boss about a new idea, or you need to talk to your team and motivate them, you know pretty much a good time to do that and the kinds of things you need to be saying to those individuals to motivate them. But again, this is about building a larger framework and perspective and robust picture about who the people are that are important to you, your work, and your life.
All right, thank you. Adele, do you want to chip anything? Or we're good?
Chip is the expert on investigating information.
Yeah, yeah, you nailed it. You nailed it. Yeah, yeah, you nailed it. Yeah, the information is perfect and clear. So now I know you've made a lot of statements about, how leaders are meant to go when it comes to fear. So now, do you have a practical advice? Because we have listeners who are business owners, leaders, executives listening to this show. So if you're having a one-on-one um, talk with maybe all of them together, so what practical advice would you give to our listeners who might be facing their own high-stake situation and struggling with fear that nobody knows about?
I would say you have to figure out the types of convincers or people. What type of convincer are you? That's first. And what type of people are you trying to convince? And especially in a high stakes situation. Here's what I mean. We feel, based on our research and based on what we've written in the book, there are two types of convincers. There's an emotional convincer. This person tends to lead with stories and anecdotes and their emotion, how they feel around about things. And then there's a fact-based convincer, right? The person who sort of looks at things from a more very logical, they want data, they want information when they're either trying to convince someone or they're being convinced themselves. So what I would say is look at the room. If you're with a room full of engineers and you're trying to get them to face their fears and do something different, you're not going to approach them with the emotional stories, right? I mean, these guys are going to laugh you out of the room if you do that, right? They're not even going to listen to you. They want data, they want facts, they want science, they want math, they want things that prove that the bridge is going to stay up, right? I mean, like engineers are wired that way. Not to say that they don't want the emotional part of the story. That's probably part of it. But if you lead with the emotional story, you're not going to motivate them to do anything. You're not going to change their perspective. You're not going to push them past their fears. Because if you don't convince them in the way they want to be convinced, you're out of the game right from the start. And the same goes with an emotional convincer. If you walk up to a person who's very emotional, and you're like, these are the, here's all the facts and stats about why you're wrong. And it's like, okay, well, you're not really focused on my feelings. You're not focused on how I emotionally took that in. And I can't listen to all your facts and stats because I feel like you don't understand me. And so, you're not going to move that person to a point at which they can actually move forward. So, think about it. Are you an emotional convincer? Are you a fact-based convincer? What's your preference? And then be able to be flexible when you are trying to convince others. And most people aren't, right? Most people kind of have a way of convincing, and that's it. That's the thing they stick to because it's always worked for them.
All right, thank you so much. Chip, anything?
The thing
Practical advice?
I'd add to that is the idea of what you're focused on is going to determine a lot about how the situation unfolds. So what we tell leaders is that if you're focused on your big fear, you're going to lose. You're not going to get your head into the game. Here's what we mean by that. So for me, as a hostage negotiator, if I focus in on the gun that the person's holding to somebody's head, I'm out of the game, Jay. I can't function because I'm only thinking, okay, if this all rides on me, if I get it wrong, somebody could lose a life. Similarly, an executive who is dealing in a crisis situation, so many that Adele has faced in these circumstances, if they're so fixated on what is going to happen to the company if they get it wrong, or what's going to happen to their careers, they're likely to be fired by the board. If that's what they're focused on, Jay, they're out of the game. They're not going to help themselves, their company. They're going to be ineffective. So what we have them do is not to focus on the gun or the big problem that could end their career. What they're to focus on are the things they can control, on the steps that Adele is going to give them. Hey, here are the next 5 moves you're going to have to make. We're here to make them with you. We're going to do everything in our power to ensure that your team supports you in these efforts and that they follow through on what they need to do. These are the things that need to happen. It's not, think about, this crisis or, what's going to happen if you get it wrong. No, think about the positive things that are going to happen, and they're going to see it. The first step, the second step, it's going to become so much better with every move they make.
Yeah, they need
Yes.
to calm down. They do. They really do.
Yeah.
But they have to see a couple of wins up front.
Yeah. That's so true.
All right, thank you so much. So as we round up, so let's look at the future outlook of fear itself. So I'm gonna have this question that I would love you both to answer. So how do you see the role of fear evolving in the context of leadership? That's one. Business, politics, as we move forward into the increasingly, fast-paced world where everything is digital, fast, everything is not slowing down. So how do we see the role of fear evolving in the context of this industry?
Well, that's a really big question. But I'll try to give maybe one part of the answer, I think, which is this idea of an echo chamber, right? Like this idea of if I am focused on seeing things from one perspective or another perspective, those things are going to show up. So if I have a red feed and I watch Fox News and I I want to listen to everything on a conservative side, I'm going to see that. And I'm going to see that in every conversation. If I'm more liberal and I'm focused on like CNN and I'm in the New York Times and I'm reading these publications from that point of view, I'm going to see everything from that point of view. And I think what's scary is there's not a lot in the middle, right? Just looking about this political standpoint, there's so much gray in the world. And I think the fact that they've got us so polarized, very difficult to see the gray sometimes. And I don't think that that's as much a part of the conversation as it should be from a political standpoint and even from a business perspective. And you see that with people's fear about AI and technology and taking over. And it's either you're for it or you're against it, or, and it's like, there's not so much black and white. There really is a gray. I feel like the news media, social media, the way in which we communicate with I obviously have a big answer here. The way in which we communicate with each other is largely focused on, we believe that can so often get railed. I was just one other quick comment about that. I was one of the first people to focus on fake news. I actually was called up by the Wall Street Journal, and I wrote a series. I wrote a 2-part series on fake news and how it was going to impact, business. And it was one of the first pieces. And I think that this term of fake news seems like it's new, but it's not. I mean, it's always been there, and it's the fact that we now get it so quickly with our devices and our technology. That's the difference. But fake news, yellow journalism, all that, it has always existed. It's just the speed at which we get it that's different.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, Jay, to that is that, human nature has always been it has always struggled with differences. We've always been bedeviled by somebody that looks different from us, that acts differently, that speaks differently, that has a different cultural background, that comes from a different context. It is again hardwired into us to be fearful of the different. It's human nature. And if we work hard on this, we can overcome a lot of that. But the future, I think, just like Adele so adeptly pointed, is a counter to that, because things are happening so fast at the speed of punching your phone. You're going to have an instant diatribe of a political bend that is going to take you down its own rabbit hole if you are aware and allow it to do so. But what we try to strive for and ask people for is to gain a larger perspective, to gain clarity around their ideas and their opinions, because much of what and how we function in our world can be incorrect. It can be misguided. And we are subject to, Adele knows this so well, working in the PR industry, we are subject to forces that we see it on a second by second basis that will influence us on how we think and feel. So I think your very large question is thus that, if we don't get a handle on our own individual accountabilities of how we're going to show up in the world and how we're going to treat other people, it's going to take us down a bad path.
All right. Thank you so much for that view. I know, it's a very big question, but that's why I save it for the last. So, yeah. So as we round up, I always do this, and we always ask, our guests to, suggest 5 resources, depending for the topic for today. So can you suggest 5 resources that listeners can actually, probably books or, whatever the thing is, and they can actually read more about this topic about fear.
Sure.
All right, I'll let you go.
So I think our book, Convince Me, is certainly one resource I would recommend. We have a master class that we're putting on in Washington, D.C. It's October 22nd. The master class goes through a real live hostage negotiation experience. Attendees get clues sent to their phones. They get to work and de-escalate with a role player in real time who's an actor. And they're practicing all the skill sets Chip knows while he is directing them. In addition, they get to know all of these different things that we've talked about today on the phone at a more deep level, how to use a convincing continuum. So that's certainly a resource. Tons of articles, on this topic. We've been featured in Fast Company and Inc. The forensic listening. If you just Google forensic listening, you'll see a bunch of resources pop up, as well as our book. Yeah, just I hope people go and check it out and really push themselves past their biases.
All right, Chip, anything?
Oh,
We're
that's
good.
it.
All right. So, are there any final thoughts or key takeaways you leave to our audience as we round up?
Yeah, never start with your strongest point first if you're building an argument, especially if you're trying to change people's mind. If you start with your strongest point first, all people do is dig in their heels. and they don't listen to anything else you have to say. So start at a point of agreement.
I think the other is to recognize that, just because we think we understand the person that's in front of us, or that we work alongside, or that we see daily, doesn't mean that we actually do. And the ways that you can break through that, to find out about who they are, what their motivations are, what their dreams are about, is to discover, like we said in forensic listening, really take an authentic interest in that other person.
All right, thank you so much. So thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Winner Circle Podcast, and that's all for today's episode of the Winner Circle Podcast. I want you guys to check out the book and read more information about them. I'm going to put all the information you need at the description tab, so you can get more information about them. So I want to thank our amazing guests, Adele and Chip, for their input and knowledge shared on today's episode. See you soon, guys. Have a nice day, guys. All right.